Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Robert Gore. I feel good about this because I met just about everybody yesterday, and giving a speech is so much easier in front of people you know. They cut you a little slack and everything. And I'll need a little slack. I'm not, let's just say my public speaking could always stand some improvement. So this is good. This is a lot better than standing up in front of 200 people you don't know. My background, I grew up in New Mexico. I went out to school in California. I went to UCLA. I got graduate degrees in business and law from Berkeley. And then I lived in California for almost 30 years after that. Most of the time of which I was a bond trader for a Southern California, one of those old line partnerships. And I was in charge of the fixed income and proprietary trading. I was also on the executive committee, so I did that. Around about 2010, 2011, I knew I was getting very tired of trading bonds, and also had kind of a spiritual dimension to it. I was asking myself, because I was trading a lot of municipal bonds, I asked myself, do I really want my tombstone to read, "Here lies Robert Gore. He helped a bunch of over-indebted municipalities go deeper in debt"? No, I did not. And I'd always wanted to write. I had written one novel. 2012, I had a trader who was working for me, and the technical term for it is he blew up. Took a big loss. My firm and I came to a parting of the ways, moved out to New Mexico. Now I'm in Albuquerque. I have a blog, Straight Line Logic. I've written 3 novels, 2 of which are for sale here. I've done all that, and then the last 2 years I've been involved first as an investor, and now as an investor and a principal. I'm running one of their applications operations for a company called 4i, and I'm not going to go into that, but if you want to read about it on the internet site is up there, and my email. Both of my emails are up there, so if you want to take down my contact information, there you go. Okay, let's get to the meat of all this. My topic is how to survive an economic collapse. And first question you want to ask is there going to be an economic collapse? The answer is yes. Quite sure of it. Timing, I'm not so sure of. But let me go into why I think we will have an economic collapse. 1987, Alan Greenspan was the newly installed chairman of the Federal Reserve. 2 or 3 months after he took over, had a stock market crash, October 19th, 1987. Market went down 25–30% in one day, scared the hell out of everybody. Greenspan responded with what's called making ample liquidity available, which means anybody who needed to borrow money basically could. And from that, Greenspan, and it worked. Stock market recovered, the economy recovered, we didn't have a depression or a recession or anything else. So from that, Greenspan learned something goes wrong, throw liquidity into the system. And I'll go into some of the mechanics of that a little later on. So we had this cycle. Early 1990s, S&Ls are imploding. Greenspan responded the same way. We get a big, and as a result, we get a big bull market that runs throughout the 1990s. 1997, 1998, Asian debt crisis, long-term capital management, get a room full of Wall Street types together to essentially bail out long-term capital management. Again, looks like the end of the world. Greenspan again, more liquidity, more debt. Catastrophe avoided. 2001, actually Y2K. This time Greenspan threw in a bunch of liquidity before a crisis. That didn't happen. The Y2K, computer bug. World went on, nothing happened. But we still had a lot more liquidity, puffed up the stock market and the bond market. They crashed again, the tech wreck. Greenspan responded as he always did. 9/11, more liquidity. Finally, we get to 2008, 2009. We had a mammoth housing bubble, and we had a mammoth housing finance bubble. Anybody who could sign a mortgage could get one. So debt bubbles work until they don't. And to draw a graphic of what a debt bubble and then what happens subsequently, you get a slow buildup of debt. Albert Einstein said the most powerful force in the world is compound interest. You hit a point of inflection and all of a sudden your debt's going like this. And this can take years. This happens much quicker. It took from 87 to 2007, 20 years to blow up the debt bubble in 2007 that fell apart in about 16 to 18 months. And you probably remember how breathtakingly quick that was. New headline every day, Lehman going bankrupt. Merrill Lynch, Bank of America has to buy Merrill Lynch, this, that, Bear Stearns. And it all happened just like that, which is one thing to keep in mind, especially when people express skepticism. The stock market topped out October 2007. Okay, within a year, Lehman Brothers was bankrupt and the whole world was falling apart. Okay, what happens is our financial system is leveraged, and leverage is just another word for saying in debt. You put down 20% to buy a house, you get a mortgage for the other 80%, you're leveraged. The problem with leverage is that you dramatically cut down your margin of error. If you have a mortgage for if you put up 20% and you have a mortgage for 80% and your house goes down in value 20%, you have zero equity. If it goes down more than 20%, you're insolvent, technically. Maybe not realistically, you have other assets, so on and so forth. You can withstand the loss, wait it out, wait for the market. But technically, you're insolvent, at least as far as that house goes. So we all know what happened in 2007, 2008. We had massive insolvencies. It started in the housing market, spread to the housing mortgage market. Okay, Benjamin Bernanke swore that it would remain confined to the housing market. How did that work out for you, Ben? Not well. It spread, and the reason is debt is interlinked, and it's not, you can't corral one class of debt. Okay, and what they were doing with mortgages was turning them into securities. Everybody's looking for yield because the Fed has driven yields so low. Everybody's looking for it. This goes all over the world. It gets on people's books. So that class of assets gets wiped out, which is what happened. And then when you start talking about some of these derivatives, they're hypersensitive. You know, these things get sliced and diced and cut up. So certain investments, certain financial instruments are hypersensitive. It only takes a 1 or 2% move, and then all of a sudden the cash flows you're counting on aren't coming in, and what you were calling an asset is now a loss, and you're taking a loss, which means you're not going to be making investments, distributing money throughout the system, and it all implodes. And that's why it's so quick. Okay, so the whole financial system freezes up, which is what happened. And we all know what happened. A lot of those financial institutions, a few of them went belly up. Most, even the belly up ones, belly up institutions, got acquired at very favorable terms. They're trying to put whatever patchwork they can on the system, so that's what they did. One real important thing that a lot of people don't realize, if a lot of these financial institutions had to value their assets at what their assets were actually worth, what somebody would actually pay, they all would have been out of business. They all would have shown huge negative equity. They're levered up, markets moved against them. So quietly that most people aren't aware of it, March 2009, the Financial Accounting Standards Board changed the rules. They said, you don't have to value your asset at what the market thinks it's worth. You can value it at what you think it's worth, what your models are. Okay? That's pretty slick. So all of a sudden, all these negative equity institutions revalue their stuff, and that turned out to be the exact bottom of the market. And I'm not saying one caused the other. The market was massively oversold. It was, and I'll go into market psychology a little bit later on. But that's what happened. Okay? So if you're out there investing, let me give you one word of advice. And the cynics in the audience, the people like me when they were doing this, and you saw it on Zero Hedge if you're a Zero Hedge reader, they call the mark to make-believe, because that's exactly what it was. But it saved the banks from potential runs and all sorts of other catastrophes. So some people justify it that way. But if you're an investor out there, I mean, what you see in terms of a financial institution's books, you can't believe, even if they're filing it with the SEC and everything else, because they can put any value they want on most of their assets. All right. We also had the Fed participating in the rescue. The Fed, as you all probably remember, dramatically lowered rates. In this country, they took them down to zero. In some of the European countries, they took them to negative numbers, which conceptually, and I'm not going to get into it, it's an abomination. You can't have negative interest rates almost by definition, unless you've got central bank putting their thumb on the scales. The Fed bought, the deficit exploded. The Fed bought a lot of the newly issued debt. And at this point, I want to make one important conceptual and kind of nomenclatural distinction. People said, well, the Fed poured money into the system, they printed money. That's not what happens. What happens?
No, don't we erase that?
What?
Before you erase that,
Yeah?
where are we at now?
Right about here.
Right on.
Okay.
Glad we're there.
This is how it works. What the Fed does when they say they're printing money, it's fine, so, is they're buying securities from a bank. Okay. Assets, liabilities, assets, liabilities. So everybody, let's say they're buying $1 million worth of securities. Okay, so for the bank, they're selling a security. So one of their assets is down $1 million, and they're getting a credit with on their account with the Federal Reserve. The Fed is the bank's bank, so they get a credit. So plus, and we'll just call it deposit, $1 million on deposit. What the Fed is doing is they are gaining what in securities. They are taking on a liability. Okay? The deposit that's the asset of the bank is a liability of the Fed. So $1 million there. Where did that liability come from? This is the abracadabra part. Thin air, correct. This is the abracadabra part of central banking. That came out of nowhere. It's an electronic entry. That's not printing money. And the reason I'm belaboring this distinction is because there's an important difference between the Fed incurring a liability and between the Fed printing the green stuff. And I'll go into that difference in a little bit. But that's what's going on. That's the mechanics of it. And it's just that simple. And the Fed's balance sheet from 2009 to, I believe, 2016. And I'm going to use the term expanding the balance sheet because that's technically much more correct than printing money. The Fed's balance sheet went from 800 billion to over 4 trillion, expanded by a factor of 5. Okay? And I'll talk more about that. Greenspan had an idea. Now, by training, I got a BS in economics. Probably call it BS too. But Bernanke's economics were, you blow up asset prices, and that creates a wealth effect that circulates through the economy and allows the economy to recover. So regular type people say, well, shouldn't the financial markets be a reflection of the actual economy? Okay, no, we reversed it. We're going to make the financial markets, and they're going to be the horse that draws the carriage. Interesting idea, and total BS. But that was the idea. So basically what that meant was we're using debt to solve the problems of a debt crisis. What's the solution? More debt. What's the solution to alcoholism? Have another beer. Exactly. All right. So let's fast forward 10 years. Where are we? The stated nominal debt back in 2007, 2008 was a little over 200 trillion. Now it's a little short of 250 trillion. Okay, by the best counts. It's probably more. There's probably stuff that slips through the cracks. But that's stated nominal debt. That doesn't count things like the Social Security liability, the Medicare unfunded liability that David had up on U.S. debt clock yesterday. That's anywhere from 125 trillion to 225 trillion.
On top of the 250 trillion.
That is correct. Okay. That also doesn't include global derivatives. Okay. And the estimates on global derivatives are anywhere from another 250 trillion to well over 1 quadrillion, which is 1,000 trillion. I've got to say, the numbers are so mind-boggling. But it tells you what kind of shape we're in, that even the estimates vary from 250 to over 1 quadrillion. Nobody has a handle on any of this stuff.
There's not that much money in the world.
The gross domestic product of the world is about 75 trillion. So just the nominal debt is over 3 times the gross domestic product of the world. If you're looking at 1 quadrillion in derivatives exposure, 75 goes into to 1,000, what is it, maybe 8 or 9 times? No, more than that, 12 or 13 times, excuse me. So that gives you an idea. Okay, now, Warren Buffett called derivatives weapons of mass financial destruction, and I'll explain to you why. And Warren found out the hard way, because he bought something in the middle of the financial crisis. I forget what the institution was, but they were loaded with derivatives, and I think he's still trying to unwind these derivatives. Okay, weapons of mass. If I'm a derivatives dealer, and I did trade derivatives when I was trading. If I'm a derivatives dealer, I make a commitment, and usually I'll make a contrary commitment. I'll be long and I'll be short the same derivatives. And I say, okay, they cancel each other out. So when the regulators call and say, you know, what's your derivative exposure? Well, zero. Everything's netted out. In normal circumstances, you know, life goes on. They've been doing this for years. Nobody questioned it. What happens though? If your counterparty on one side calls and says, we're insolvent, we can't make good on our derivative exposure. Now your nominal zero exposure has just become a real exposure. And this is exactly why Lehman Brothers did this. Because all sorts of counterparties were bailing. And once one counterparty bails, then everybody else is vulnerable.
No.
Dominoes go down. That's why Lehman Brothers reverberated so much. You say one financial institution, what's so bad about letting them go belly up? Well, we saw what happened to Lehman Brothers. I'm not saying Lehman Brothers should have been bailed out, but you got to realize when you say, you know, let them go, the consequences can be huge because of this daisy chain, this interlinkage. The other problem with the debt we have, you got a credit card. You run up the balance. At some point, you can't pay your credit card. Or at some point, it starts crimping your lifestyle. You borrowed a bunch from the future, and now the future wants you to start writing some checks back. So that's going to slow down your lifestyle. You're going to quit going to the movies and out to the nice restaurants and whatnot. Countries are no different. Okay? Since 2008, the trend rate of growth, economic growth, has been declining. Not just in the US, but all over the overly indebted world. Okay, debt service takes its toll. Okay, we can't consume as much because we're in debt. And consumption itself is a zero sum, it's actually a negative, okay, because of the debt service. You borrow $1,000, you're going to go out and buy a couch, okay? The couch produces no economic return for you, but you still got to pay the interest on the debt and you've got to repay the principal. And most of the debt that's out there, and just about all the debt that governments incur, is basically for consumption. They're not investment goods. They produce no economic return. And that's, you know, Social Security checks, that's welfare checks, that's military spending. None of it produces an economic return. So the burden's getting higher and higher. Let me tell you a trick the statisticians play. Headlines: GDP growth, second quarter, 4.4%. Okay, I go out and borrow $100 and then I take the family out to dinner. Okay, there's been no net change in my wealth, my economic being. I've enjoyed something, but now I've got a liability. Okay, so I would not say by going out to have dinner, I'm wealthier. The GDP statistics completely ignore the debt that's used to fund that 4.4% growth. Put the debt back into the equation, and it's probably been years since we've had real growth. You hear about this great economy, and I'm not blaming Trump, they all do it, and it's the way the GDP numbers are calculated, but it's wildly misleading if you don't take into account the liability side of the market. The other
So if you do that, what is the actual GDP?
beats me.
But it's not 4.4.
It's not 4.4, and it's probably a negative number. You have to really come up with an answer to that, you have to look at not just the debt that the governments incur over the period, but individuals, corporations, municipalities. And you have to back out all that to honestly account for your GDP. All right. The other thing that happens is the world gets more in debt. I'm a lender, I lend you money. Yeah, you're a good person. but let's see a little collateral. Lenders want to see collateral, right? The more debt you incur, the more your income streams get collateralized, and the more your assets get collateralized. So out there in the big wide world, there's very few income streams that aren't pledged for one thing or another, and there's very few assets that aren't mortgaged. Okay, what does this mean? One of the offshoot, and David mentioned this last night when I was at his house, we were talking, he says, you're going to talk about hypothecation. Hypothecation is a fancy word for pledge. Okay, I pledge my asset to repay my debt. The U.S. government bond market, and I still find this astounding, and I've known about it for years. I own a government bond. I'm a securities dealer. I need to finance my inventories. I need to finance my bond position. So I hypothecate or pledge my bond to somebody who gives me money, and I agree to give back the money plus a little bit more interest. Okay, the person that I gave the bond to turns around and pledges that bond to another dealer. And so on and so forth and so forth. To this day, the legal, say somebody in the daisy chain goes belly up. Who gets the bond? It's been hypothecated and rehypothecated numerous times. Who gets the bond? To this day, that's not a settled legal issue. They may still be, and huge problem with the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. Everybody's claiming the same collateral. In China, they go one up on that. They take a pile of copper or gold or what have you. They use that as security for a loan. And then the same people use it as security for another loan and another loan and another loan and another loan.
So same game, just physical asset.
Yeah, but nobody's rehypothecating. It's just the same borrower using it as collateral for multiple loans.
Oh, I see, okay. So there's not a daisy chain, it's more of a wheel.
Yeah, it's just a variation.
Yeah.
Okay, and none of this matters until it matters. But when it matters a bunch. And it gums up the whole system. And even Federal Reserve monetizing debt and blowing up their balance sheet 24/7 can't really solve it. It's a legal issue.
Bob, isn't it also an arithmetic issue? If I have $1,000 worth of copper and I pledge that as security on $10,000 worth of, or 10 $1,000 loans, there's only $1,000 worth of security. So somebody is wildly, like zero, undersecured, right?
Correct.
So there is literally
Nine people.
Right, yes, there are several somebodies.
Yeah,
There are
exactly.
laws that prevent us from, if you have a $200,000 house, you can't take out 10 loans for and get $2 million on it.
You can't.
That's completely illegal. But
And unethical.
But that's the genesis of the whole system.
America.
Yeah. It's illegal for you to do it, but this is how we generate wealth across the planet.
Bingo. You're not generating wealth. You're generating the illusion of wealth. Big difference. Okay, so I'm telling you all this so you appreciate just how interlinked these things are and how a butterfly flapping its wings in Singapore can lead to the world financial crisis, global financial crisis. What's happened in the cycle since 1987 is every time the rescues get bigger, and they never allow debt to wash out, they never allow prices to wholly reset, so they set the stage for the next collapse, which requires a still bigger bailout, so on and so forth. I'm going to put forth the arguable proposition that this next financial collapse, I don't care how big central bank balance sheets get, they can't rescue the system. It's too big. it almost sunk back in 2008, 2009. We were very close to seeing that ultimate washout implosion. And hard as some people will think this is, that should have been allowed to happen. We should have had a washout. We should have had a realization among everyday, ordinary type people that there's something fundamentally wrong with our financial system that led to this. We might have had a whole changed environment, because we talked about this yesterday. It's going to take some sort of big change, some sort of catastrophe. Will wake up. I was talking to Lucy about this morning. We'll wake up more people than all of us out there proselytizing, telling people, informing people. That's what it's going to take. The only thing I'm unsure of is when. And I was unsure back in the last one, and I saw it coming. We sold our house in 2006 to the top of the California housing market. I set up a proprietary trading desk to short things. The Big Short, great movie. If you haven't seen it, download it. If you're looking for something that makes a lot of this at least semi-comprehensible, great movie. It's got its humorous points, everything else. I can't recommend it highly enough. Or read the book. It's a good book. Michael Short is the author, or Michael Lewis is the author on that. But Adam Smith said, there is much ruination in a nation. And he's right. So I can't tell you when we reach the point of ruin, but I'm pretty sure we're going to get there. And you say, how do you define collapse? What is collapse? Okay, rough and ready definition. In the Great Depression, economic activity shrunk about 25%. Okay, and that was horrible enough. So I'm going to say collapse is any kind of contraction in economic activity with 25% or more. And I think it'll be far more this time. They could get up to 50%, maybe even a little more than that. There are factors that will come into play that go the opposite way, but so that's my definition. So the question becomes, if you're trying to survive an economic collapse, the first question you got to ask, is this going to be an instance of inflation leading perhaps to hyperinflation, or is this going to be deflationary? And I have my own answer on that. I will say, if governments have their way, we will get inflation and undoubtedly hyperinflation, if governments have their way. Inflation benefits debtors. They borrow now, they pay back down the road with dollars that are worth less. That's the technical definition of inflation is inflation of whatever it is you use for money, the supply of that. So debtors gain. There's no bigger debtors in our world than governments. So they've got a rooting interest in inflation, devalue their own debt. That being said, I don't think inflation's what we're going to see. When I get later in the speech, I'll give you strategies for dealing with both, but I think deflation is going to be the order of the day. And I'll tell you why. Everything that we consider money in our system, credit cards, and I mentioned this yesterday, bank deposits, everything that we consider money is actually debt. As I said yesterday, the green stuff is debt, Federal Reserve notes. Funny sort of debt, but it's still debt. The whole global economic system rests on debt, and we've blown up the largest debt bubble ever, by far. I believe we've reached the point. I was talking about GDP measurements and how you have to back out debt. Back in the 60s, I saw an estimate, every dollar of debt bought you $1.20 or something of growth. I think every dollar of debt that we add to the system now is bringing us some sort of negative number of growth. just because the debt service burden has grown that much. So borrowing more does nothing for you. You saw the graph of what a debt collapse looks like in an interlinked global system. And this all happens very fast. Now, you can say, well, every central bank in the world is going to be expanding their balance sheet to prevent these debt collapses. But let me give you some numbers. Even conservatively, when you look at unfunded pensions, regular debt, derivatives, you're well north of $1 quadrillion. Okay, 1,000 trillions. In the last financial crisis, I believe that the total central bank debt went from, say, 5 trillion to somewhere close to 20 trillion. 4 times expansion. That includes China, Japanese central bank, the ECB, European Central Bank, and the US Central Bank. So it went up 4 times. So let's say they do that again. They take it from 20 trillion, let's say it goes up to 5 times, just to get a round number, $100 trillion central bank balance sheet versus 1 quadrillion of debt just basically collapsing in on itself. The best analogy I can think of is, say somebody blew a hole in Hoover Dam wide open. The water's leaking out. The central bankers are going to be like somebody standing on the edge of Lake Mead with a garden hose. Okay, they're going to try. You know they're going to try. But think about it this way. The last crisis, central bank balance sheets expanded, the Fed's balance sheet expanded 5 times. Did prices go up 5 times? Not even close. I mean, there's all sorts of room to doubt official government statistics, but I'm not paying 5 times what I was back then for groceries, for, well, maybe medical care, thank you, Barack Obama. But groceries, gas, whatever. I'm not paying 5 times what I was paying back then, okay? And the reason is we're in a debt-saturated economy. It's like trying to water a lawn that's already 2 inches underwater. And this is where what I was talking about comes into play here. The Fed can create money by expanding a bank's asset, by expanding the amount they have in deposit with the Fed. But somebody has to want to borrow that money. Okay? And if they don't, that money just sits on a bank's balance sheet. It does nothing. Now the Fed did something else, little noticed. When they started expanding their balance sheet, the banks weren't loaning it out because nobody was trying to borrow money. Everybody was trying to get out of debt. Everybody was trying to sell assets. Everybody was trying to get liquid. So nobody wanted a loan. If you're in debt up to your eyeballs, that's the last thing you need. And you're going the other way. So some 2 trillion of that 4 trillion sat on bank balance sheets. And then the Fed quietly decided, let's pay these guys interest on those balances. We need to reliquify the banks. The Fed is basically a banking cartel. I mean, that's what it is. They're the bank's agent of influence in Washington. So they started paying them interest so the banks would have a little more money to reliquify, repair their balance sheets, whatever. Nobody really noticed that, but it was a lot of money. 2 trillion, even 25 basis points, which is a quarter of a percentage point. It adds up. Nice thing the Fed did.
For their pals.
For their pals, yeah. Now, if you had an underwater mortgage, you were looking for relief,
Didn't help.
your retirement fund had a big hole blown in it, you thought the government should maybe do something for you, forget it. Not going to happen. So, although I believe the preponderance of probabilities is that when the shit hits the fan, we will see deflation. I'll talk about both of them. Just as preppers, as people who are prepared, you know you have to think in terms of contingencies. You know there's no certainties, so you try to cover as many bases as you can. So a lot of the preparations for both an inflationary and a deflationary episode are the same. You're going to do the same thing. The two kind of models that I'll give you are Venezuela right now, where we're having hyperinflation and whatnot, and the Great Depression. The one thing that happened in both of them is economic activity collapsed. Production of goods and services collapsed. People in Venezuela, go over the bridge to Colombia to buy toilet paper, to buy, powdered milk, what have you. That same thing in the Great Depression. We had 25% unemployment and economic activity collapse. So that's the one common thing that you know. And now I'm going to tell you something that everybody in this room knows by heart. The key to survival is going to be the degree to which you can advance towards self-sufficiency. And I'm not going to belabor that point because you are not a crowd I need to belabor that point with. So self-sufficiency self-evidently involves having a nice stockpile. Oops. Don't let it get on those books. Self-sufficiency involves having a stockpile. I'm not going to run through all the items that should be in wherever you're storing your goods. There are websites, there are books, there are magazines, there are all sorts of information out there. We all have our favorites. We all have different checklists. All I'm going to say is have the goods you need, have the medicines, the foods, the fuels if you need that for generating type activities, everything. Have as much of what you're going to need. Do the research, okay? I personally can say I'm nowhere near where I want to be in terms of this. Many of you out there are probably feeling the same thing. We need to make preparations. The time to start is today. You saw where I put the progression on my little chart there. Okay. The other thing that's self-evidently important to everybody in this group, skills. You can't have too many usable skills in this sort of situation, especially if it turns into a prolonged thing where the stockpiles start running down and whatnot. Then you get to some fairly elemental sort of questions like food, water, energy, medical care, and stuff is just unavailable. So the more you know how to do for yourself, the better off you're going to be to yourself and to the people you're trying to protect, whether that's your family, your friends, your group, the people you're working with, the people you've prepped with. So this is all down the pipe type stuff. And I don't have a lot to add to this discussion. There's tons of stuff on the internet. And you can learn incredible skills just off the internet, if you're willing to apply it in real life. Canning, what have you, auto mechanics, home health care, whatever it is, the information's out there. The important thing is that you make the effort now, okay? Because if things really go to hell, there may not even be an internet. There may not be electricity. You just don't know. It's a contingency thing. Finally, the other important thing, and again I'm preaching to the choir, develop a network of people you trust. Start talking to them. If you haven't already, start talking to people. Get to know the people around you. Now, a lot of us are in areas where the people down the street think you're crazy if you start talking about this stuff. people poo-poo it, so, but you've got to learn that. Learn who thinks you're crazy, find people who you think would be good in a crisis sort of situation, people with special talents, special skills. Talk to them if you can. Do whatever you can do, okay? Because people are going to change when the crisis hits. And you want to have an idea what they're like. I'll tell you one story. I was out in LA during the Rodney King riots, okay? And I was living in a place called Brentwood. It's basically kind of a bedroom area for UCLA students and whatnot. And the riots hit. I went to a grocery store. Grocery store is packed. And I'll tell you, if you're living in an apartment environment, if you ever have, you don't get to know the people around you at all. They're in, they're out. You don't make friends in apartments. You don't make meaningful connections, by and large. I mean, there's exceptions. But anyway, I go to the store. It's every man and woman for themselves. People are grabbing things off the store shelves. People you thought were nice people are elbowing each other, so on and so forth. I remember grabbing 3 bottles of peanut butter. A woman looks at me, I said, I've never been through a domestic insurrection before. Okay. I was also in LA when the Northridge earthquake hit. Believe it or not, I was sitting on the toilet. I lived in a house at that time, and I had a dog. I used to walk the dog every day. So I knew everybody in the neighborhood, at least enough to say hello, how are you, have a little conversation or whatnot. Entirely different feel. Now, first thing you do when you go through an earthquake is you get the hell out of your house because you know the aftershocks are coming and you're better off outside than inside. So everybody's outside, they're on the street, everybody's talking about, oh, what if we lose electricity? We'll have a big barbecue. Entirely different feel. Not that we were all good buddies in the neighborhood, but we at least knew people enough to be friendly with them, to trade jokes with them. Entirely different feel. So even if you can't develop a great network like the kind that a lot of you are developing, at least get to know the people in your neighborhood, the people who are going to be out on the streets if things happen. Get an idea of that. And just to reiterate, do the research, do the work now. Don't wait. Now to separate deflation and inflation. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, we could have deflation followed by some sort of government abomination where they buy everything. In Japan, they don't just buy bonds, they buy what are called exchange traded funds for equities. They monetize any piece of garbage anybody gives them. They have been trying since the early 1990s to get inflation in Japan. Hasn't worked. Not for lack of trying. Japan's government debt to GDP ratio is one of the highest in the world. Just another reason why I don't think what we're going to see is inflation, the Japanese experience. Okay, so inflation, you've got more money than goods and services available. So you got more money chasing a shortage of goods and services. Deflation, money's hard to come by. Surpluses of goods and services, nobody wants to buy them. Prices tend to go down. Prices definitely went down in the Great Depression. Prices are definitely going up in Venezuela. So let's talk about inflation. If we have inflation, okay, hyperinflation, what have you, I'm sure most people in this room have physical gold and silver. I, for one, I love gold as much as the next guy. I wrote an article called Real Money on my website. Argued that gold and silver is the only real money, that anything that is a debt cannot be considered money. Okay, that's a hardline position. It'll get you kicked out of economics departments all over the country if you say it. But to me, that's the way it works. And if you want to read the full argument, it's on my website. So I like gold and silver, beautiful stuff. But you got to ask yourself, why are you buying gold and silver? And I'll talk to preppers. I got this amount of gold, this amount of silver, and today the price went up $20. And so what? You're not buying it as a speculation. If you're buying it as speculation, admit that you're doing so and speculate. Fine, take your profit when it goes way up, buy it back, do whatever work whatever magic you can in the financial markets. The only thing, but if you're not buying it for speculation, if you're buying it for a collapse type event, then your gold and silver has one use. It can be traded for something else. Medium of exchange, and that's all it is. And you talk to a lot of people in the prepper community or whatnot, and some of them have this kind of quasi-mystical sort of feeling about gold and silver. Well, no. Tiny ingot of silver may be good for you because you can exchange it for, a giant pack of toilet paper. If you can't, it doesn't do you any good. You can't eat it, it's not medicine. Okay, so on and so forth. There's two other big problems that I see with physical gold and silver. The first one is what I call the 6102 problem. In 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which basically outlawed the private ownership of gold and silver. You had to turn it in. Don't think they won't do it again. When economic collapse comes, governments are going to be absolutely rapacious. Rapacious like you've never seen them before. Okay? Nobody's going to want their phony baloney money. They're going to want real assets, and gold and silver are real assets, historical money, everything else. Don't think also that they don't have a record of most of your gold and silver purchases, especially physical gold and silver. If you bought it online, they've got a little notation in a computer in Utah. If you bought it through a legitimate dealer, same deal. Most gold and silver purchases, I have no doubt, are on a government database somewhere. The other danger I see with gold and silver, collapse comes, you're trying to exchange your ingot, your old coins, your whatever. That's like a red flag. You take your silver thinking, yeah, I really need some food here. It's like a red flag saying, I am a prepper. I thought out of all this beforehand, and way back home, I've got a lot of stuff you may want to steal, you may want to take. So that's a very real danger, I think. So you got to be pretty darn careful who you're going to trade your gold and silver with. So
who's going to take it? Who's taking the gold and silver?
you mean
People that are opportunistic that things are going to change? I mean, if I have gold and silver, who's going to give me toilet paper for that?
somebody
You
with
can't
a
have my toilet paper is where I'm going with that.
Yeah, somebody who still has some toilet paper, and somebody to whom you say, I'll give you enough gold and silver to make it worth your while to undertake all the risks of holding this gold and silver.
Well, they're anticipating things are going to get better and that the gold and silver is going to be worth more than the toilet paper.
Right, or they just, they have outlets for exchanging their gold and silver for useful things. Maybe that's how they got the toilet paper to begin with.
But the guy that owns the toilet paper factory needs gold and silver more than he needs food and medicine? Or?
Exactly.
Okay. He's got more toilet paper than he's got anything else.
Wrap it up and make that a question.
Yeah, let me get to your question. Okay, we're just about done here. I'm going to say a good word for cash. I know cash is trash, U.S. government, so on and so forth. But in a deflationary situation, the value of cash, the green stuff, is going, you're going to buy more goods as the prices of things come down. So your cash becomes more valuable. It is also much more readily acceptable and tradable than precious metals. So whatever you've got in gold and silver, make sure you've got a stockpile of cash, make sure it's in your house, not in a bank. I'm going to say two bad words about electronic money. Cryptocurrencies, grid down situation, you're broke. Same thing, people don't think of bank and security firm deposits as electronic money, but they are. Your money you deposit is just an electronic notion. I'm going to say one bad word about speculation. There's always a few people who say, I'm going to get rich come this next whatever. No, you're not. First off, you have no idea, and I did this for 20 years, the emotional demands of speculation. And that includes whether you're making or losing money on whatever it is you're speculating. You probably, the most effective speculations are in very sophisticated financial instruments, options, ETFs, futures, or whatnot. Very few people have the knowledge to do it. And it messes with your head when you should be thinking about feeding your family, about making them safe, that sort of stuff. Don't speculate. I've been on both ends. Either way, it works that way. I've lost a lot of money, made a lot of money. Okay, one final word to wrap it up. This too shall pass. Okay, as bad as it's going to look at the bottom, when it looks the worst, that's probably the bottom. Okay? Humanity's had its up and downs for a long time. This too shall pass. And there's a couple of side benefits for this. A real economic collapse will bankrupt the government, which means the government will have less to spend on things like intervening in foreign countries, welfare spending, so on and so forth. Good. Economic collapse will do more for our movement, the freedom movement, than anything that's been done to date. Government simply won't have the wherewithal to do what they've done for the last 100 years. So, in closing, I will say that for the freedom movement, economic collapse, net, may be a huge benefit. There you go.